the company into getting into that whole thing, because I do a lot of straight architectural acoustics as well, a lot of church work,
Really?
things like that, some large-scale sound system design things.
That's interesting. We can talk about that a little bit too, because
We're ready to go, John. When you're ready.
all right, let me get rid of these papers. Okay, maybe, so George, you and I will be having a conversation. You'll be looking at me and not him.
Right.
And if you could start by introducing yourself, and then that would be great. And then maybe something about what you do. You know, you could state that for the camera, and then I would ask you a question. My questions will be cut out of the final
Okay.
edit, and there'll be clips associated. I mean, we'll cut it up into clips. So I won't be talking through it. I'll just ask you a question and leave you alone.
Okay.
I'll try not to step on you.
Well, that's all right.
So could you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Yeah. My name is George Augspurger, and I have a consulting practice that concentrates both on architectural acoustics and, to a large extent, in recording studio design. Have been for years. My practice was set up a little more than 30 years ago. And because at that time I had connections with especially Capitol Records, some of the music labels, some of the recording studios, that was kind of a natural for me. I was already familiar with recording industry and with the recording studios, and had enough of a technical background to be able to work in the acoustical area and specialize in that particular area.
When you are given the job to create an acoustically, I guess you would say, acceptable, or how do you use the words? If you create a good space for acoustics, how do you think of it? How do you deal with it? How do you go about the process?
Like almost all the other designers, you rely heavily on past experience. None of us actually duplicate rooms. Now, occasionally, yes. But having had usually the humbling experience of having something that you thought was going to be special turn out to be not so special, and then having to spend a fair amount of time working on it. Excuse me. You gradually become familiar with certain areas that you're comfortable with, sizes, shapes, geometry. Control rooms and mastering rooms, at least for me, are more difficult than studios, than the recording spaces. Mainly because the recording spaces, there's a lot more variety in what may be acceptable or what the client may want. Whereas over the last 20 years or so, the standards for a good mixdown room or a good mastering room have become almost universalized. And it's interesting if you look at the designs that various studio architects and designers are doing. Yeah, there are differences, and there are differences in approach, and there are some differences in acoustics, but basic geometry, the basic sound of the room that we're aiming for is pretty much accepted. Nobody wants, there was a time 20 years ago or so when it was very fashionable for recording studios to have a unique signature. They wanted something that nobody else had, you know. That, under the pressure of competition and one thing and another, has pretty much disappeared. People know a good sounding room when they hear it, and that's what they expect to have for a good professional working environment.
How do you go about creating that environment? I mean, do you measure sound waves? I mean, could you talk about that?
We do to some extent. Again, in a small room, any small listening room, a home theater, a control room, a mix-down room, acoustically speaking, from an acoustician standpoint, these are small rooms. A large room is Carnegie Hall or something that size. And small rooms are not very easy to design using traditional classic acoustic theory. It doesn't hold up very well in these small environments. So, yes, when it comes to noise isolation, control of background noise, that kind of thing, sure. We use established techniques that are available. There are all sorts of construction details and wall systems and one thing and another that have been tested. We can predict how much isolation can be achieved. But when it comes to the actual sound of the room, then everything becomes much more subjective. And efforts to define a room in terms of objective measurements are much more difficult in small rooms. Also, there is, as you probably know, in the last 10 years or so, it's possible to build computer models that operate in real time. You can hear what the room sounds like. Those work quite well on large spaces. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has made one that's even remotely convincing for a small room. The slight details make a much bigger difference in a small room.
Could you talk about the specific challenges that you had with respect to the room that you built here at Loyola?
One of the things that I have to, or that I try to establish at the very beginning, is the primary function of the room. Because if it's going to be used for multi-format mixing, or if it's going to be used primarily for surround sound, let's say for TV sound mixing, something like that, yes, the acoustical requirements for surround are somewhat different. And the reason is that ideally, in a surround sound environment, as Tom Holman has tried to establish and explain over the years, the idea is to have a very neutral environment where you can create the acoustic environment electronically as part of the system. Two-channel stereo is just the opposite. There we depend a great deal on early reflections, on reflections in the room, things that the room is doing to help fill out and establish the stereo image. And the room becomes harder to design, certainly harder to predict. Again, we rely, as do all the designers, on successful designs that we've done in the past. We know that if the room is much wider than 20 feet, for example, it's not going to sound the way most people expect a mixed-down room to sound. There are other considerations that come into this. We try to make the room not only sound good at the mix position, but try to get the overall sound picture to carry toward the back of the room, because it's very common these days for VIPs to be sitting behind the aisle or even in the very back of the room. And people are back there making judgments. So they have to be able to hear pretty much, more or less, what the actual engineer is hearing at the console. Again, that didn't used to be true, but it's an important part of the room design.
Well, so first of all, could you give me, this is for the kids back home, a definition of acoustics and the science that's involved in it, just maybe some introduction. If you were going to talk to some 15-year-olds or 18-year-olds about acoustics, what would you say?
All right, acoustics is one of those scientific terms that relies on both objective and subjective measurements. We are talking about sound waves in air. And the first thing that a student in any course, learns is, all right, sound in air is compressional waves traveling at 344 meters per second. And then the next things that enter in are what happens at the boundary surfaces. Well, some of the sounds are reflected, some of the sounds are absorbed or transmitted to adjoining spaces, and that becomes an important consideration, both in terms of what the room sounds like inside and how well it's isolated from other sounds outside. And then the big hang-up in any audio work, and mostly in acoustics, is this relatively gigantic frequency range that we are dealing with. We are dealing with wavelengths that vary from something less than an inch to roughly 32 feet. Whereas in optics, which has many similarities with acoustics, what's the range of visible light? Something like 1 octave. So trying to get the kids to mentally use wavelength as a yardstick and understand that what happens at low frequencies and what happens at voice frequencies and what happens to the higher overtones will all be different. They're totally, it's a matter of scale. Totally different things are going on in the room and reflecting the sound back to your ears. And then this all ties in not only with the directional area, reflections, early sound, reflections, but the temporal thing. When do all these various things arrive, relatively speaking? And it becomes very, very complicated. Over the last 20 or 30 years, the top names that design concert halls have made considerable strides in being able to narrow down certain attributes that can be measured, that can be used to specify desirable traits versus undesirable traits. But as any number of mediocre halls will testify, the mere fact that, we now know something about it and we can identify it doesn't mean that we can hit a home run every time.
It does seem that there's a lot of poorly designed major facilities. So it seems very subjective, this. What precautions do you take to try to get it right? I mean, how does it go wrong? Where does the problem come in? Is it the measurement of those that wide range of sound waves? Is that really the essence of the problem?
No, that's what makes the room design a lot more difficult. The fact that you are dealing with this great difference in wavelength. One thing that has helped probably more than any other single factor, again, in the last 25 years or so, is that control rooms have become larger. Originally, the recording industry followed the broadcast industry, where you had a control booth. And as you know, in South America, you still call it a cabina. Very small room, you're jammed right up against the wall, loudspeakers up over your head, and that's still the way a lot of control rooms, TV control rooms, operate. This is totally unrealistic in terms of trying to predict what it's going to sound like in somebody's music room at home, where the room now is probably at least 12 by 15 feet, something like that. They are sitting typically 10, 12 feet away from the loudspeakers. The room is probably very little, if any, acoustic treatment. And still, what differentiates, in my mind, a really good mix from what may be a successful mix this year or something, the really good mixes are multi-layered. Somehow the engineer is able to develop something that will sound good in a very mediocre automobile system. It will still sound good in somebody's pretty decent home system. It will sound even better in a well-designed home theater system where now you can start hearing all these details that you missed before, but it still hangs together. You aren't locked into a particular listening environment. And I've been lucky in that in subjectively evaluating the mixing environment, it has turned out for me that my judgments, my subjective judgments, happen to coincide or parallel very closely with those of a lot of very successful professional recording engineers. So I can't think of an instance once I got a few years under my belt. I can't think of any instance in which there was a really total or major disagreement. Now, that doesn't mean that my designs agree with everybody. I'm just saying a lot of the successful recording engineers. There are some, I won't name names, no, that don't like my rooms at all. But they are relatively few. I'm lucky in that the majority of successful recording engineers, are willing to work in my rooms.
Do you feel like your rooms have a certain personality that reflects your personality?
I think I spend a lot more time than most of the other studio designers in trying to get a stereo image from that pair of loudspeakers that has width, that extends beyond the speakers, and that has depth. And I know it's a weakness of mine that I will, if all I'm doing is trying to make myself happy, I will push that too far for a recording engineer. And I've run into that. I remember when I was working with Shelley on a couple of the rooms at A&M. And we're going through all sorts of nonsense that most people, what are you doing? We're setting little pillows in front of the console, or we're hanging little things up on the wall and comparing our, impressions. And I remember at one point I said, no, I like that. It really spreads the image out. And Shelley said, yeah, but I don't want it spread out that much. So he knows from his experience what it takes to turn out a good commercial mix, whereas I would tend to push for something a little more glorified, a little too good.
So there's no real objective standard. The ability to make a mix in an acoustic space that's going to sound good in other acoustic spaces that are of wide variety, that sounds like a little bit like alchemy to me.
Well, again, it's because the majority of professional mixers have more or less agreed on what seems to work for them. And it's not a totally dead room. Having said that, if you're producing hip-hop and rap, it's just the opposite. These guys want two very loud speakers, very close, and that's all they want to hear. But that's a genre in itself. Now, that's unusual. For any of the more normal pop or country and western or even classical recording, you want more room sound. Probably not quite as much as you would in a mastering room. The mastering room is set up to be as much as possible like a top-notch home listening room. Whereas the mix room, as I said, you don't want to push it too far or you may fool yourself. It may sound better than it actually does. having said that again, my impression is, I am so impressed by these guys that turn out these things. Yeah, you want to make them comfortable, but the fact is these guys can turn out a good mix under almost any condition. They know what they're doing. Whereas the younger guys that are just coming up, oh, I can't work in this room. That flute shouldn't sound like that. Well, it's going to sound lots of different ways in lots of different environments. They tend to glom onto one little thing and let it disturb them. Whereas professional engineers, I remember one time, I can't remember who it was, at one time in a new room, was brought in on a project. Do you think you can work in this room? He said, well, let's see. We had the band was rehearsing out there. He said, take a U-42, put it out there over the drum kit, and have the drummer just, jazz it up a little bit. He listened. He said, okay, now I know what a U-42 over a drum kit sounds like in this room. I'm ready to go.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So the idea of what about genre? You mentioned hip hop. How do you build flexibility into a control room that allows you to use it in a variety of genres?
Again, the hip hop, the rap thing seems to be about the only one that really requires, its own little niche. I mentioned earlier surround sound versus two-channel stereo. Yes, the surround sound room typically is not quite as live, but even that, it was very interesting over the initial introduction of surround sound for television and radio and the development of standards. What the mixers on the West Coast finally pretty much agreed on between the film mixers and the audio mixers was a room that they felt comfortable working in either medium. And it's a room that is not totally dead, not nearly as dead as a THX theater. But that little amount of room ambience seems to work much better in a smaller room for a variety of different areas. And as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, I mentioned Tomlinson Holman, who is the guru of surround sound and the originator of THX theater sound. He is a professor at USC. And recently we redid the acoustics of the control room in the School of Cinema, TV, to his requirements. And he was satisfied with the result. The room is roughly the size of yours. And again, it was not a question of deadening it down for surround sound. He's using a 5-1 setup, but getting just the right amount of room sound to complement what he's hearing, to the point that, yeah, I'd be comfortable with that either as a film sound mix or as a audio mix for some other medium.
Well, tell me about the materials that you use in your designs to accomplish the results you're trying to accomplish. You're dealing with absorptive and reflective surfaces. Talk about that for a second.
Yes. The various materials and the various combinations react, again, differently to different frequencies. We normally think of a hard surface like a concrete floor being reflective, which it certainly is. If it's large enough and hard enough and solid enough, yeah, it's reflective at all frequencies. A much smaller object, a little 2x2 patch on a wall, for example, still very reflective, but not at very low frequencies because it's not large enough to interact very much with low frequencies. We will use combinations that may be perf board, for example, which you see in a lot of the older studios, has, when used properly, the desirable property that high frequencies are reflected, but you can get a substantial amount of low frequency absorption. And there are no miracle materials. The various acoustic kits that you can order off the web will certainly probably make a very live room sound better, but there are lots of other ways that you can accomplish equally desirable results using much less expensive materials.
Well, that brings to mind a couple of questions. Let me shift into the larger rooms. I spent a long time in New York, and in those days, everybody's complaining about the acoustics in Avery Fisher Hall, and even after the redesign of Carnegie Hall, people were complaining about that. How is it that that can be such a, you can build something and get it wrong?
Well, again, there is a common thread in that classical music performance industry. Why is it that the older halls sound so much better than the newer halls? Well, because the ones that sound better are the only ones that still remain, and the others are all torn down at one time or another. And it became again, an accepted venue. The father of architectural acoustics, musical acoustics, is Wallace Sabine. This is an American discipline, architectural acoustics. And when he designed Orchestra Hall, the initial reviews were scathing. They were terrible. But again, it was because apparently it was not what that particular audience had become used to. And once it had time to settle in and got a wider range of people having a listening experience in the hall, it became the standard by which others are still judged.
So you don't know what it's going to sound like until you hear it, and then even then it's going to change.
Again, these people are doing a lot better in the last 20 years or so with the computer modeling and building scale models and one thing another. Walt Disney Hall in Los Angeles, for example, the acousticians spent several years with scale models where you have to record things and then play them back at a slower speed and one thing another to try to get a real feel for all the little things that are happening in a hall that become almost impossible to predict.
Fascinating. Well, if you were going to give some advice to a young person who wanted to refine their interest in this science of acoustics, what should they know? They need to take physics. What should they do?
The physics part of it is very important. You aren't going to get anywhere without enough background to at least appreciate the difference between physics and folklore. And there's an awful lot of folklore floating around, too. And what usually happens is that a young student, yes, will take physics courses. He will hopefully attend a university that has some courses in architectural acoustics. There aren't that many. And then he will be able to get an apprenticeship with an architectural firm that does performing arts venues, where he will actually have a chance. And again, as you know, experience counts for everything. I won't name names, but I did a recent project with a very well-known, well-established acoustical firm. And there were complaints from a client about the acoustics of the studio. Okay. They sound clacky. Okay. So the young guys from the acoustical consultant's office, went out and spent 3 days, and they had reams of paper and all sorts of charts and decay curves and early sound and one thing and another. And they'd gone to great trouble to make the room variable, lots of drapes and one thing or other that could be drawn. And, you know, they were totally dumbfounded. What possibly, and a couple of them were musicians. It wasn't that they were, you know, not able to understand what was being said. So when I came in then to help with the final checkout, the first thing we did was, okay, I think just subjectively, yeah, the drapes are a little too much. You know, let's take the drapes down, get them out of the room for the time being. Okay. Right now, everybody wants a very live room for a very live drum sound. And again, they may not know the difference between a good room and a bad room, but hopefully we will give them a good room. Once the drapes were out, the room sounded better. Then we set up a drum kit where I had originally envisioned it. And when the engineer explained to me, you know, how much trouble he was having trying to make this to get a little decay, a little tail on the kick drum. And then I began to, you know, hear what he was hearing. Then we started experimenting with areas down near the floor level. All right, maybe having a trap right there is not such a great idea. And we sealed that off, and oh, you know, it begins to sound better. And then we started sealing off a few more things, and oh yeah, it sounds better. And then I said, you know, the room is still far from being too live, and we still have all these drapes that we can always bring back in. So then we started putting reflective panels on the ceiling. And in a matter of 4 hours, the room was transformed from, yeah, you can work in it, to something that, yeah, we'd like to work in it. But it's all subjective.
It's a fascinating proposition. There's a place in Grand Central, there's a little space. Have you heard about this space? You can stand in the corner and whisper in the corner, and the person in the other corner across this space.
The whispering galleries, yeah.
How does that work?
The whispering galleries, they were once the physics was understood way back in the 15th century, something like that. They were built as entertainment devices. It's a parabolic reflector, and if you build in this case an ellipsoidal, three-dimensional ellipsoidal reflector, which has two foci, and anything originating at one can be heard very clearly in the other. And that was part of the secret of the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake, which had a big elongated domed roof. And they used to, as part of the tours, have a group of people in one end, and then at the other end, at the lectern, the tour guide would, you know, with a great deal of theatrical flair, drop a heavy pin, you know, dong, and yes, you could hear it very clearly. But part of it was because those two positions did help amplify the sound much more than if you had gone out in other portions of the room.
Again, physics.
You know.
Well, one other thing, if you had, if you're some young person who wants to put a home recording studio in their basement, is there something they can do? How do they become aware of this? Is it just it sounds good to them and they like it, or can they do certain things in that space?
What it takes more than anything else, and I've noticed in the last few years, you read in Mix magazine, you read in some of the other magazines, some of the older guys, you know, upon retirement and one thing and another, and the same thing, what would you recommend to the younger engineers? And the answer is always the same. Listen. Spend a lot more time listening. Spend a lot more time going to live concerts. Spend a lot more time listening to unamplified instruments. I was in a studio a couple of years ago where the engineer was setting up from where he'd left the day before, and simply setting up the big SSL console, checking his raw, dry tracks where nothing had been added, no reverb or anything. And, my ears pricked up, golly, a lot of these pure tracks, just the instrument itself sounds so great, before you start messing it up. It's that kind of listening that the young kids should be doing rather than madly trying to add layers and layers and layers to emulate the latest thing that they've heard as a hit record. I saw another old-time producer not too long ago, and he told me, that one of the things he does with the younger engineers, they always want to know, what's your secret? How do you mix these? He said, the secret is a good tune. If you've got a good tune, and he said, here, try it. He throws something up, play with the board, do anything you want to. You can't kill it. It's still there. You see, that's what your basis has got to be.
That's fascinating. Now, what about in a recording studio, you have miking technique to also interact with this room.
Mm-hmm.
And you're recording, say, a bass that has long sound waves. Do you record that close up, or do you record it far away? Or?
There again, now you're getting out of my area of expertise. The recording engineers these days will use lots of microphones. That doesn't mean that all of those microphones are going to wind up being in the final mix. It eliminates a lot of trial and error at the beginning. They can immediately listen to 3 or 4 different mics at different locations. And they will usually, except for pure classical recording, use a mixture of close mics with maybe 1 or 2 room ambience mics. If they are after some room sound, they will be able to control that amount with the microphone that they've discovered. We'll hang one there, and that seems to pick up the overall sound. That's the kind of thing that's done a lot more in classical recording, but the pop mixers use it too.
What is the effect of the audience in a room?
Audience is highly absorptive, and one of the reasons that the upholstered chairs that you buy for a concert hall are so incredibly expensive is because they've gone to a lot of work to come up with a chair design that will have the same absorptive characteristics whether or not someone is sitting in it. And that makes a modern hall, again, like Walt Disney Hall, much easier for performers, for a variety of performers to work in than the older halls. And again, staying West Coast, Royce Hall at UCLA, which was used for years as a good concert hall and a recording venue. But there, for recording, they had to bring in sheets of fabric and pillows to try to simulate an audience because the hall depended on an audience to sound right.
Yeah, I've heard of people doing that. Recording in the Atlanta Symphony Hall and actually putting down plywood because they wanted the recording to be more lively,
Mm-hmm.
and it seemed like the seats were absorbing all the sound. I guess everybody's got their own way of looking at it. So when you come into a room like you did today and you are approving your design, you've seen it now constructed, the first thing you want to do is hear music?
Actually, the first thing I do, and this is another trick that you can't teach anybody, they've got to learn how to do. No, I'm listening to myself as soon as I come in the room. You develop the facility to listen to your own voice in a space. And this is very handy. It's worth developing because if you immediately hear something that you know is not right, that you're going to have to do something about, better you know it before the client climbs onto it, And that's the first thing. Is the room relatively neutral sounding, or is there something funny that always seems to be popping out? Is it relatively uniform, throughout the working area. And once I'm satisfied that there's not something horrible that I'm going to have to fix before I do anything else, then the next thing is immediately listening to music. And after I've listened to music a while and played a little bit with loudspeaker placement and console placement, one thing and another, and have a feel for what I think the room's strong points and weak points are, then I maybe start making some measurements. If you make the measurements first, which some designers do, you will almost always glom onto the wrong thing. Oh my God, on that sound decay trail, look at that funny spike. We got to do something about that. Well, maybe you do and maybe you don't. It may be fictitious. It may have been an error in your measurement. But to immediately jump on that and spend, a lot of time trying to get rid of it and then realize that the room sound really didn't change, is a lot of wasted time.
So when you do your measurements, you're looking for uniformity, or just you've already decided it sounds okay to you when you walk in the room. You say, okay, this sounds okay.
Yeah, then we start looking at the response of the speaker at the mix location and at a little farther back and one thing another. And yeah, you can fool yourself both ways. You can fool yourself listening to music, something that sounded, oh yeah, this is nice and well balanced and warm, may have sounded that way on the particular recording that you were listening to. And in fact, there's a big imbalance between low and high frequency response. All right, then maybe we ought to listen to a few other things. And maybe, my immediate feeling was, I've got to boost the 1 kilohertz region a little bit. No, I was wrong. What I've really got to do is pull down the whole mid-bass region to make it sound right.
So, how about if you go into a room and the stereo imaging is not what you know the recording contains, how do you address that issue?
The stereo image thing has improved, again, dramatically in the last 20 years or so. Once rooms really began being designed for stereo, which means they're bilaterally symmetrical. That's the big thing. If you can't do that, at least you want them bilaterally symmetrical in the whole forward portion of the room. You can get by maybe with an extra alcove for seating behind you or something happening in the rear of the room. But the whole front image depends to a great extent on hearing the same thing from both sides. And again, without naming names, some designers have been successful with sideways rooms where they have the glass on one side and an absorptive surface on the other. But to me, they never sound as good as they should. And I will always, if I'm called in to do something, I'll start trying to balance it out a little more evenly. Maybe you don't need that much glass. Maybe we can cover up some of it. And we do need more high-frequency scattering on the other wall to start getting the thing to be symmetrical again. Again, interestingly enough, you guys who are into the multimedia thing, once you are into surround sound, into cinema sound, that's no longer a major issue. Because if I want to hear something coming from the left, I put it in the left speaker. If I want something coming from the center, I put it in the center speaker. And the fact that the left and right may sound slightly different doesn't bother anybody. It doesn't bother the cinema people at all that the center speaker never sounds quite the same as the two outside speakers. Why should it? That's the dialogue speaker. It's a totally different mindset. And yet at the same time, to try to get the music people to appreciate what the cinema people have learned about surround sound over the years is very difficult. Oh, he's a film mixer. What does he know about music?
Well, I have a question about stereo. Now, is stereo only in the rooms that you build where you think the stereo imaging is really excellent? Is that only for the person who's sitting equidistant from the speakers, or does it sound good in other parts of the room?
No, it to my mind, it should sound good in other parts of the room too. And this is tricky, and it's one of the benefits of getting some early side reflections, is that it will tend to fill in that stereo image if you're not dead center. Now, you aren't going to hear that same beautiful three-dimensional stereo image, but you still should hear a well-balanced, recording that is obviously stereo, as you're not just listening to mono. And yeah, I think that is important because, again, you may have the whole band in the room and they're all commenting on what it sounds like. And you've got to give them something halfway decent to listen to.
Interesting. Did you, in the LP days, did you tend to, mixes seem to me to be more mono-oriented because they made better sounding LPs. The broader the stereo spread, the more difficult it became to get a good sounding LP. Is that true? Does the medium, the reproductive medium that is going to carry the music, does that affect how you would mix it?
I think it does. Again, I'm not a mixer, but yes, throughout the whole days of mono LP through stereo LP through stereo tape, there was an important consideration of mono compatibility. You knew that people were going to listen to it on the radio, monophonically. Today, the number of PBS stations that broadcast part of the time with one channel in reverse polarity is discouraging because it's never been a consideration. They are always listening to two speakers in a stereo situation, and the mono compatibility, or what we think of as a stereo image, is just not an important consideration.
I think it's not an important consideration for most home listeners, right?
The guy that's just listening to surround sound on his packaged TV, no. It's not an important consideration. The surround sound, the stereo, adds dimension. That's about all it does. There's one station in New York that broadcasts everything, full surround, all announcements, everything. They figure, it will really impress their listeners. But the minute you get into any kind of serious listening, the guy with the home theater, or even the guy that has spent several $1,000s for a 7.1 surround system in his new Mercedes, is critical enough that, this becomes important.
It's an interesting problem you see walking people's houses, and there's this speaker that holds the lamp, and this speaker's behind the curtains, and it's like...
I've done a number of private screening rooms in Hollywood, and that is the eternal conflict, Well, you can't hear the speaker because it's behind that statue. Well, that's the only place the decorator will let us put it.
So much for the surround sound,
yeah.
For the stereo. It's an interesting problem. So am I to take away from this that this is basically a science and an art, and mostly an art?
I'd say it's probably equal science and art, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the things that you need to do to get a good working environment is it has to be quiet. You have to keep the background noise low somehow, and that's science. You are concerned about leakage to and from adjoining spaces or airplanes flying overhead. That's science. That's all stuff that can be done numerically.
What's the best sounding room that you've been in recently?
That's always asked people, and the studio designers, I think, always give the same answer that architects do when they're asked, what's your favorite project? It's my last one.
Well, you've been in the Gary Hall, and I have never heard music there. Is it truly as phenomenal as they say?
Yeah, it's different. It is a totally immersive surround experience where you are just bathed in music and very strong low bass. And yet this is coupled with the reverberation time that for a hall that size is actually relatively short. And one of the things that I'm hoping somebody will do in Los Angeles one of these days, as an interesting thing, the organ in Walt Disney Hall and the organ in the new Catholic Cathedral, which is only a block away, were designed and installed by the same firm. And yet we have these totally different spaces. And he learned the difficult way that the instruments had to be voiced quite differently. So we have the cathedral, which is a vast, open, concrete building. The reverb is a series of echoes that just go on and on and on and on and on forever. And yet in Walt Disney Hall, we have the opposite of this very warm, surrounding, early sound. And I would love to have somebody do a music festival where they're comparing organ and choral works in the two environments, because they're both well suited for organ and choral, and yet they sound quite different.
You think you can write music for a space?
Oh, traditionally, yeah. This has always been the explanation for some of the early church music, the Gregorian chants and one thing or other, that are made to harmonize with the late arriving echoes. Whereas for opera, you want a much shorter reverberation time. You expect to be able to hear the words, you know, one thing or another.
That's a fascinating subject, isn't it? Writing music to a pseudo-acoustic space. Is there something else about the science, before we let you go, that maybe I haven't touched on, that you think might be important to young people who are studying this art, the science of acoustics and recording technology?
There is one area that we're just beginning to get a handle on that has been brought up in both music recording and cinema with the advent of the powerful subwoofers. In cinema, it's a separate channel. It's an effects channel. And its whole purpose is to rattle the building. In music recording, the subwoofers are there to reproduce, again, very low frequency stuff, maybe artificial. There's no limit to how low you can go with the synthesizer. No limit to how loud you can make it. And a lot of the R&B recordings, and certainly the rap recordings, there's a good example of things that sound different in different environments. If some of these kids could actually hear these in the control room the way they were originally mixed, you know, it's awesome. It really is awesome. The amount of bottom end is just incredible. Now, how do you make this jibe with a commercial enterprise where you've now got maybe 3 recording studios in the same building? And if somebody really lets loose with the subwoofer, you're going to hear it in the whole building. Same thing is true of home theater. This is something I bring up to Tom Holman periodically. You know, you specified home theater, 95 dB at 35 hertz. Well, fine. You know, I'll hear that, and so will my neighbor, and so will the neighbor across the street. You know, how do we contain this stuff? It's almost impossible to maintain any kind of isolation at those very low subwoofer frequencies.
Well, you know, with kids listening to music with earbuds and turning it up loud and maybe damaging their hearing, and people's hearing changes over time, and they say that females hear more than males, and then young people hear better than. I mean, with all that variability in the human ear, how does that affect your science and your job and your work?
You know, from my own experience, because my ears are old enough now that, you know, I would not dream of making a judgment about, you know, what I think is happening up in that extreme upper register. You know I don't hear it anything like the young guys do. Okay, you know, that whole region where you hear this magic air that kind of surrounds things. But that is the main area of difference. And again, the whole area where the music is, and especially at the levels we listen to in a control room, it's typically around 85 dB. An older guy is, probably hearing pretty much the same thing that a younger guy is hearing. Again, the difference is his standards are different. Again, I remember reading an interview in Mix magazine with one of the engineers that had just turned 65 or something, and that was his comment. He said, "Yeah, I can't hear 20 kilohertz anymore, but I can tell you which brass player is sharp."
That's important. Well, one other question, the difference between listening loud and soft in a control room. Young people tend to listen to loud. Can you hear the detail in the same way that you can listen to it? You can hear it if it's at a low level, or how do you feel about that?
There's actually a big divergence among professional engineers, and it isn't the young old thing so much. I've seen a lot of the younger engineers that partly because they're worried about their hearing, will not listen at these ungodly levels, or if the client wants to, they'll put in earplugs. More power to them. Starting probably with Roy Thomas Baker. There was a whole generation of rock music mixers who wanted to listen at just unbelievably loud levels. And they grew accustomed to it. I will not. If somebody wants to crank it up that loud in the control room, I scram. I get out real rapidly. On the other hand, a lot of pop music, and certainly 100% of rock music, that part of the whole mystique is you've got to have it loud, or it really doesn't sound like much of anything at all. But loud in that case, again, 85, 90 dB. And that's less than a Sforzando package from a symphony orchestra.
We used to compress the dynamic range for LPs, and even they're compressing CDs in cars, because if you have that dynamic range of...
Listen, any pop music CD is compressed unbelievably, and there's a lot of big acrimonious debate about that in recording circles right now, and there doesn't seem to be any solution. People want their CD to sound louder than the next guy's. Turning up the volume is something that doesn't occur to anybody, and even though what do we got with a typical CD? Something like 60 dB of dynamic range. They're actually operating with maybe 12 or 15. It's all in the extreme upper end. To some extent, maybe this is kind of a leveling factor, because before this became the standard, the radio stations would, of course, compress everything way down. And so what you heard coming out from your local radio station sounded different than what it did when you played it at home. Now, they're pre-compressed. They sound pretty much the same anywhere. And even MP3s, I've heard MP3s that really sounded pretty decent. But again, it's... the kids are doing it because that's what the kids are doing this year, and the number that are really interested in music, really interested in good sound, or why some things sound different than others, that's the minority. That's the ones that wind up as music majors.
Well, so it seems to translate, if you're going to spend a lot of money in a recording studio or a control room on your monitors and on your playback, the whole thing is really finely tuned to get down to an MP3. If it sounds good there, it's going to sound good there.
Yeah, that is, as I say, a source of much discouragement in the recording industry. About the only thing you can say is, well, there are still enough people, you know, that are interested in turning out a good sounding CD with a minimum of compression. So these are the ones that are not chasing this year's or this week's hit tune. These are the ones, you know, again, the James Taylor thing, that are trying to turn out, you know, an artistically satisfying album.
The dynamic range in Disney Hall would be, what would you say? What's the ambient sound in that hall?
In a good symphony hall, the ambience is established by the audience. The hall itself will be down somewhere around NC 15. The audience, just with the normal shuffling and papers and one thing or other, will bring that up to about NC 25, which is the THX standard for a 5-1 control room.
That's 25 dB?
It's a certain curve, but yeah, as a rough guess, that gives you, in terms of overall loudness, more than 60 dB of available dynamic range between what could be the softest passages and what will be the loudest passages. In a symphony hall, you may take advantage of all of that. There will be actual quiet passages. In a pop recording, very rare. Silence indicates to the user something is wrong. So it is definitely compressed, but a good performance is still compressed down to maybe, you know, 40, 45 dB of dynamic range, where you still can get the impact of something that is a crescendo or something that is a sudden softer passage, a quieter passage.
But it might be an absolute range of only 60 dB from loud to soft?
In a symphony hall, it's greater than that. You've probably got a range of, in theory, of 80-something, because the background level is, if it's NC 25, I'm trying to think what that works out to in dBA, but in dBA it's down again somewhere 15, 20, and the loudest is something like 120. So you've got more than 80 or 90 to play with. And in a place like Disney, which will produce enormous crescendos without subjective distortion, yeah, they take advantage of it.
Really loud, really soft.
Yeah.
One last question. We don't think, I guess I should speak for myself, is a typical building that's non-music related is having acoustic needs and principles. But all architects deal with the acoustics of their buildings, correct?
Well, they should deal with the acoustics of their buildings, yes. And right now, for example, there's a lot of interest in classroom acoustics, in establishing standards, because traditionally in the lower grades and one thing or another, classrooms have been just plaster boxes. And with noisy kids, the noise level gets to be excruciating. It may make it very difficult for a teacher to be understood. Speech intelligibility suffers. And so they're trying to develop standards that architects will accept to try to get a much more desirable acoustic environment. Any place that, you know, communication has to take place, or any place where excessive noise may be dangerous, becomes important, obviously, in the workplace.
Again, this is a matter of materials and placement.
Mm-hmm.
I was at in Ephesus a couple of years ago, and this huge 25,000 seat theater carved into the side of this mountain, and I climbed to the top, and I could hear the people on the stage talking. Why is that?
Part of it is because it's very quiet. And the natural amphitheater does, there have been some studies recently that show empty, because we haven't brought in a 25,000 person crowd to test these things. But empty, there is scattering and one thing and another over those seats that does tend to project the sound upwards quite efficiently. But as I say, a lot of it is just the fact that they were and are very quiet environments. I live on the side of an arroyo, on the side of a canyon, and it must be 2 or 3 city blocks as the crow flies, and still, construction sounds and one thing and another can be heard very clearly. If a workman talks loudly, I can understand what he's saying that far away.
You ever engaged in the acoustics of instruments? Is that a topic that you find interesting?
Again, it's always interesting, but it's not anything that I know very much about.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for talking to us.
Okay.